Hello students, welcome to the EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Rajeshwari Sinha and today in this lecture I am going to talk to you about hypothesis testing, confidence interval and p-values. Let us see what are the objectives that we are going to address in this lecture today. We are going to understand what is hypothesis. We are going to look at hypothesis testing and its various elements such as null and alternative hypothesis, identification of p-values and the concept of confidence interval. We will also look at the process of hypothesis testing and errors associated with hypothesis testing. We hope you have an enjoyable time listening to this lecture. What is hypothesis? Hypothesis is basically an explanation or a theory that has been tentatively accepted to allow the interpretation of certain observations, phenomenon or a scientific problem and which can be subjected to testing by further investigation. Hypothesis is of two types, research hypothesis and statistical hypothesis. Research hypothesis is a supposition that motivates the research. The hypothesis that has been proposed after numerous and repeated observations. On the other hand, statistical hypotheses are hypotheses that may be evaluated using appropriate statistical techniques. In hypothesis testing, there are two statistical hypotheses involved which we have discussed further in this lecture. Hypothesis testing is a procedure to support one of the two proposed hypotheses. It refers to the process of deciding statistically whether at a given level of probability the investigation findings reflect chance or real effects. Hypothesis testing finds application in the area of biology, medicine and healthcare. Elements of hypothesis testing. The key elements of hypothesis testing are null hypothesis, alternative hypothesis, identification of the level of significance, test statistic, identification of the p-value or confidence interval and conclusion. Null and alternative hypothesis. There are two types of statistical hypothesis. Null hypothesis H0 or hypothesis of no difference refers to the hypothesis that sample observations have resulted purely from chance. Alternative hypothesis H1 or HA is the hypothesis that is believed to be true when the null hypothesis is rejected. In hypothesis testing, the statistical convention is to begin with the null hypothesis. Researchers are required to conduct studies, measure outcomes leading to the evidences which are strong enough to reject the null hypothesis. For example, let us consider a null hypothesis that for a coin to be fair and balanced, it might be that for half number of flips we would get tails. The null hypothesis H0 in this case will be probability of 0.5. In this case, the case that number of heads is different from the number of tails will be the alternative hypothesis or probability not equal to 0.5. Now, if the coin is flipped 50 times, the result is 20 times heads and 30 times tails. Therefore, the null hypothesis is rejected. Thus, the coin is not fair and balanced. Test statistic. A test statistic is another way of hypothesis testing. It is a standardized value which can be calculated during a hypothesis test from a given sample data. It assesses the statistical significance and finds out the degree to which the data are compatible with the null hypothesis. P-value. A p-value denotes the probability that the result is as extreme as that observed or more extreme than the one observed value if the null hypothesis is true. A threshold value alpha called the significance level of the test is chosen before performing the test. Conventionally, alpha is taken as 5% or 0.05. Interpretations of p-value. P-value less than 0.05 means result is inconsistent with the null hypothesis, the null hypothesis is rejected, alternative hypothesis may be accepted and the result is statistically significant. P less than 0.01 indicates that evidence against null hypothesis is strong and result is statistically highly significant. P less than 0.01 indicates that evidence against null hypothesis is strong and result is statistically highly significant. P greater than 0.05 indicates that evidence against null hypothesis is weak and null hypothesis is not rejected. P almost equal to 0.05 implies that a marginal p value and null hypothesis is not rejected. Confidence interval. Another informative measure used to test hypothesis is known as the confidence interval or CI. It represents a range of values which has the specified probability of including the true value of the variable. Confidence limits are the upper and the lower endpoints of the CI. Confidence level is obtained as 1 minus alpha and expressed as a percentage. For example, a 95% confidence interval means that 95% of the values of x that make up the distribution will lie within 2 standard deviations mu or the mean. When p less than 0.05, then the 95% confidence interval will exclude the null value. Therefore, the CI will indicate if the null hypothesis is rejected or not. Smaller sample sizes have large CIs due to lack of precision in the point estimate. Students, we have now reached midway into this lecture. We hope you are finding this lecture useful. I hope you have been able to understand the basics of hypothesis testing by now. Let us now go into further detail. In the next section, we are going to look at 4 major components of hypothesis testing. These are the process of hypothesis testing, the various kinds of errors, which is type 1 and type 2 errors that can emerge in hypothesis testing, the region of acceptance and region of rejection, and finally, we will look at one-tailed and two-tailed tests. Let us take a look. Process of hypothesis testing. The hypothesis testing process consists of 4 major steps as shown in the figure below. This includes stating the hypothesis, formulating the analysis plan, analyzing the sample data, and interpreting the results. Errors in hypothesis testing. While putting the null hypothesis to test, 2 types of errors can result, type 1 error and type 2 error. Type 1 error. This error occurs when null hypothesis has been incorrectly rejected despite it being true. The probability that a type 1 error will be committed is called the significance level alpha. Type 2 error. This error occurs when null hypothesis has not been rejected even when it is false. The probability that a type 2 error will be committed is called beta, while probability that this error will not be committed is called the power of the test. In this section, we will learn about the region of acceptance and region of rejection. Region of acceptance is a range of values wherein null hypothesis is not rejected if the test statistic falls within this region. Region of rejection refers to the set of values that lies beyond the region of acceptance. In this case, the null hypothesis will be rejected if the test statistic falls within this region. One-tailed and two-tailed tests. One-tailed test refers to a test of a statistical hypothesis in which the region of rejection lies only on one side of the sampling distribution. For example, consider a set of numbers with mean m. Let null hypothesis be m less than equal to 10 and alternative hypothesis be m greater than 10. Therefore, the region of rejection would consist of a set of numbers greater than 10. That is on the right side of the sampling distribution. Two-tailed test refers to a test of a statistical hypothesis in which the region of rejection lies on both sides of the sampling distribution. Let us consider a set of numbers. Let the null hypothesis state that m equal to 10 and alternative hypothesis be that m less than 10 or greater than 10. The region of rejection would consist partly of numbers that were less than 10 and partly of numbers that were greater than 10, that is on both sides of the sampling distribution. We have now come to the end of this lecture. Thank you for being there with us. But before we end, let us summarize what we have learnt in this lecture today briefly. Hypothesis is basically an explanation or a theory that has been tentatively accepted to allow the interpretation of certain observations, phenomenon or scientific problem and which can be subjected to testing by further investigation. Hypothesis is of 2 types, research hypothesis and statistical hypothesis. Hypothesis testing is a process of deciding statistically whether at a given level of probability the investigation findings reflect chance or real effects. The key elements involved in hypothesis testing are null and alternative hypothesis, test statistic, p-value, confidence interval. Hypothesis testing process consists of 4 steps: stating of the hypothesis, formulating the analysis plan, analyzing the data, and interpreting the results. 2 types of errors can result in hypothesis testing, type 1 and type 2 errors. Thank you for watching this lecture on hypothesis testing, confidence interval and p-values.